I'm standing in the library of the Royal Asiatic Society in London on a warm June afternoon in 1983. But I want you to travel back with me to another century and another city. One February evening in 1844, the Asiatic Society of Bengal in Calcutta held an extraordinary meeting for an extraordinary person. The Journal of the Society tells us that before commencing the business of the evening, the Honourable President rose and in the most feeling and impressive manner addressed the members to the following effect.
The daily papers have informed you of the object of this meeting, but it may be necessary to explain why it has been made special, particularly as tomorrow is the usual day, and it has been determined to adhere to that except under very peculiar circumstances. On the present occasion, the circumstances are such as to make me feel confident that you will all concur in the propriety of what has been done. Mr. Hodgson sails tomorrow, and I am sure there is not a member here present who would not have regretted the loss of the only opportunity you shall ever have of seeing him in this place and of testifying, as far as we are able, how highly we are sensible of the credit which his labours and researches have reflected to the Society.
Brian Hodgson, the subject of this eulogy, had recently retired as the British resident in Kathmandu, where he was to return to complete almost 40 years residing in the Himalayas. He was respected as a diplomat, but he was renowned preeminently as a scholar.
89 distinct papers. This, however, is not the extent of the work accomplished by him.
Among the mountain villages of northwest India, he spent a year collecting information on the customs and traditions of the local tribesmen, travelling for months on end with ponies and porters. Then he moved to the valley of Nepal, a fertile bowl of land lying at the feet of the high Himalayas. It was the seat of an ancient but still flourishing civilization, based upon 3 beautiful sister cities. He was among only a handful of Europeans who had visited Nepal, and he stayed for almost 25 years, living in Kathmandu, capital of the country. His reports on the tribes, languages, flora and fauna of the region sent a thrill of excitement running through the academies of Europe. He gave the British Museum alone more than 10,000 zoological specimens and was renowned as the founder of the true study of Buddhism. In 1835, the Grand Lama of Tibet had presented him with complete copies of the 2 encyclopedias of Northern Buddhism, and he in turn had presented one of these to the Asiatic Society of Bengal.
We possess the most valuable of all his works, his book on the literature and religion of the Buddhists, a work the most complete extant upon a subject till lately but little understood, and of the highest importance to the philologists and to the historian. But this is not all.
This film could never do justice to the achievements of Brian Hodgson, but it can explore the influences and motivations behind his extraordinary quest for knowledge. Our story opens in the midst of the Cheshire countryside at the very beginning of the 19th century. Brian Hodgson was born almost in tandem with his century in February 1800. He came from a stock of long-living country gentlemen who had, it seems, no need to strive for their living. What led him, then, to occupy so many years in a condition of exile in the Himalayas? And what brought his family from their life of comfortable ease in the village of Pressbury to one of relative penury among stark military towers such as this one, guarding the uncharitable shores of the North Sea? The immediate answer to both questions lies within the turmoil of Britain's agricultural and industrial revolutions. As a growing workforce of displaced farm labourers crowded into the cities, and as the steam engine provided previously unimaginable opportunities for making profits, thousands of small banks were founded to finance new enterprises and to exploit the need for capital and credit. Brian Hodgson's father made the mistake of becoming a partner in one such bank, and after a few years' prosperity, the company crashed. The Hodgsons were forced to leave their comfortable house near Macclesfield and for almost a decade wandered in search of a fresh start in life. Finally, through the influence of the Earl of Clarendon, Brian's father was appointed guardian of the Martello Towers, coastal forts manned against invasion from Napoleon's troops, and the family moved to Essex. 2 years later, Brian himself was given the opportunity of employment as a cadet in the East India Company. Plans for joining the church were set to one side, and in 1816 he entered Haileybury College in Hertfordshire.
Perhaps no institution in the history of the British nation outside government has possessed the power and responsibilities of the East India Company. Founded by Royal Charter in 1600, this company of merchants was privileged with rights of monopoly, organising trade between England, India and China, and establishing factories abroad. In the 18th century, company ships travelling eastward to the ports of Bombay, Madras and Calcutta carried eager young clerks, managers and soldiers who were prepared to tolerate monastic conditions of existence and to risk catching fatal illnesses for the opportunity of making immense fortunes. On the return journey, those same ships carried cargoes of indigo, saltpeter and sugarcane, opium, tobacco and tea. But the greatest commodity of all was textiles. Working for the company, thousands of Indian weavers produced millions of bolts of silk and cotton to be transported to London for the clothiers and tailors of Europe. Trade prospered, and in the early 1800s, a fleet of 115 ships, manned by some 10,000 sailors, operated from the complex of docks and warehouses between London Bridge and Blackwall. But as we've seen, a new and mechanised textile industry was flourishing at home, and demand for Eastern fabrics dwindled. By 1815, the East India Company had lost its monopoly status, and was now directing much of its energy towards governing the vast territories coming under its jurisdiction. It ruled over a population 10 times that of Britain's, with an army of 150,000 men. The company had the right to coin its own money, hold courts of law, build forts, and appoint governors. It was for the education of these future leaders that Haileybury was built.
Subjects taught at Haileybury were divided into two areas, European and Oriental, and the professors employed were of the highest quality. The Orientals were mainly languages, such as Sanskrit, Persian and Hindustani, while the Europeans included classical languages and mathematics, law, and even political economy and history, subjects barely touched upon in the older universities at that time. Brian spent his first months at Haileybury lodging with Thomas Malthus, Professor of Political Economy at the college and author of the celebrated Essay on Population. Malthus was described by a contemporary as one of the serenest and most cheerful men that society can produce. Yet the experience in Britain of a growing number of impoverished and unemployed farm labourers had given birth to a dark and pessimistic vision of mankind's future, which was reflected in his writings. Human populations were destined to increase at a geometrical rate, outstripping the potential growth of foodstuffs. Within such a hostile environment, it was not possible to subscribe to a belief in man's unlimited progress. This tragic but compassionate vision was to colour Hodgson's own understanding of the various peoples of the Himalayas, some of whom dwelt amidst conditions of great splendour, while others struggled to survive in conditions of unparalleled deprivation. One can see the intelligent and gentle influence of Malthus in this report, posted from the valley of Kathmandu almost 20 years later.
Amid the dense forests of the central region of Nepal dwell in scanty numbers and nearly in a state of nature 2 broken tribes, having no apparent affinity with the civilized races of that country and seeming like the fragments of an earlier population. They toil not, neither do they spin. They pay no taxes, acknowledge no allegiance, but living entirely upon wild fruits and the produce of the chase, are wont to say that the Raja is lord of the cultivated country, as they are of the unredeemed waste. They're not noxious but helpless, not vicious but aimless, both morally and intellectually, so that no one could without distress behold their careless, unconscious inaptitude. I am decidedly of the opinion that their wretched condition, physical and moral, is the result not of inherent defect, but of that savage ferocity of stronger races which broke to pieces and outlawed both tribes during the ferocious ethnic struggles of days long gone by, when tribe met tribe in internecine strife, contending for the possession of that soil they knew not how to fructify.
Under the guidance of Thomas Malthus, the young student was turned into a thinker. In the classical order and harmony of Haileybury College, the tutor impressed on his pupil a love of liberty and a respect for the liberties of others, which was to deeply affect his work among the natives of the Himalayas. 1 year later, having gained several prizes in political economy and languages, Brian Hodgson left college, family and friends and embarked on the long, tedious boat journey to continue his service with the company in India. Brian's journey brought him ultimately to Calcutta, the glorious headquarters of the East India Company in Bengal. To find out something about the way of life there for a young Englishman, I spoke to Chris Bailey, reader in Commonwealth Studies at Cambridge University.
Well, certainly the picture that the Englishman coming out to India has of Calcutta is of extreme laziness and lethargy. I mean, the feeling is that the Anglo-Indian community there spends most of its time in bed, that it may get up in the very early morning, will go to bed for most of the day and will only emerge again for parties in the evening. But this probably is more a reflection of the climate than anything else. And it is the case that most India business was done very early in the morning. People would get up early because of the heat, and they would have done much of their official business by 8 or 9 o'clock in the morning. In the 18th century, Englishmen were really very isolated, even in Calcutta, which was the company's major city by this point. They were very much involved with Indian social life. They tended to have large numbers of Indian servants. Some of them were married to Indian women. Now, from the beginning of the 19th century, and part and parcel of this development of paternalistic social and political relations, we see the drawing apart of the European community in Calcutta, an emphasis on the fact that the Europeans ought to be isolated from the vices of the people of India, as Wellesley in fact calls it. So there is a reaction against the very riotous lifestyle which the young civilians used to operate in Calcutta towards the end of the 18th century. In the 18th century, the classic figure was the griffin, the young civil servant who'd gone out and was hopelessly drunk for months on end and probably died of cholera or dysentery very rapidly. Well, with the development of Haileybury and Fort William College, this begins to change. It's almost like an Oxford and Cambridge college system, the notion of a tutorial role by the seniors in the college, bringing the young men together so you create a corps d'elite, keeping them out of the society of Calcutta.
I asked Dr. Bailey to explain the duties of a young cadet once he left his studies in Calcutta and went out to a post in the countryside.
Well, throughout the whole of the period of the Raj, the basic duty of the district officer and his underlings was to collect information on the land revenue. The regular return of the land revenue was absolutely crucial to the functioning of the East India Company and to the British state in India. And alongside that, to administer justice. These were the two pillars of the civil services emerged in the 19th century, the administration of justice and the collection of revenue. But of course, in order to administer justice properly, in order to collect revenue effectively, the company servants needed to know a great deal about the Indian people whom they were ruling. So we begin to get, from the early days of the 19th century, these extremely detailed reports on the life and the social habits and the races of India. These very, very detailed investigations of Indian life, which are later formalized into what are called the district gazetteers of India, and become the staple bedside reading, if you like, of all the administrators in India, and indeed of subsequent historians.
Brian Hodgson contributed to just such a gazetteer in the course of his first assignment. He was appointed Assistant Commissioner, aged 19, of the solitary outpost of Kumaon, a mountainous province on the very borders of the company's sphere of influence. Together with his superior, William Trail, it was their mission to redeem the land from Gurkha misrule and convert it into a prosperous British province.
Kumaon had suffered a very turbulent history over this period, having been conquered by a number of ruling groups, including the Gurkhas, and it was fairly difficult to identify precisely who controlled the land, precisely who ought to be responsible for remitting revenue to the government. And I think the detailed surveys that Trail and Hodgson went in for in the early 19th century were a reflection of this difficulty of identifying the sources of power and influence in the society. It was necessary, in fact, for them to go to every village, virtually, to find out who the important people were, to understand tenures which were extremely confused and often conflicting. So that it's very often the case that where there's no obvious man in charge that the British can deal with, it's there that you get the most detailed understanding and the need for knowledge of a particular society.
Travelling, like these Englishmen over 100 years later, with ponies and porters, Brian Hodgson and William Trail spent months visiting isolated villages and hamlets in their quest for information. Brian Hodgson was fortunate in his superior, who not only taught him how to inquire, but also implanted in him a love of inquiry. In carrying out a systematic survey of the local population, its history, language, social institutions, and economic conditions, Hodgson learnt the essential craft skills of ethnography, and he attributed his later successes in Nepal to this period of apprenticeship with William Trail. On his return to Calcutta, the doctors repeated a warning they'd given him earlier, following a serious breakdown in health. Here is your choice: 6 feet underground, resign the service, or get a hill appointment. The Indian subcontinent in general, and the city of Calcutta in particular, was a death trap for many hundreds of Europeans in those days.
Of course, it was a very dangerous life for the British in India. Most people realized that the chance of mortality was very high. Of course, the chance of mortality in contemporary Europe was pretty high, but it was probably 50% worse in India during this period, and particularly bad in Calcutta. The figures for other Indian cities show that mortality, for instance, in Delhi in the 1820s and 30s is about the same as it was in London in the 70s. But Calcutta is particularly infectious. The climate is bad. Soldiers and sailors come in spreading disease. You have malarial swamps very close. And it's reckoned that something like 30 or 40% of the Europeans would die within the first 5 years of arriving in India.
It is not surprising, then, that a death should have brought Brian Hodgson the Hill appointment he needed. In 1820, Britain's assistant resident at the court of Nepal died, perhaps of smallpox or typhoid, both of which were rife in the country, and the request was made for a competent man to replace him. Hodgson was promoted to the post. The valley of Nepal forms a bowl of fertile land set among the southern foothills of the Himalayas. For 2,000 years or more, it has provided a natural haven for pilgrims and traders journeying across the mountains, and the seat of the elaborate Newar culture. In the latter half of the 18th century, the valley of Nepal had been conquered by the Gurkhas, who established their sway over the whole region. They had then expanded southward, coming into conflict with the East India Company.
The Gurkha rulers of Nepal themselves, and they'd ruled the country since the 1760s, were an expansionist group. They wanted to carve out more territory, to control more land revenue, and they wished to push their dominance down into the Indian plains. And the British are constantly trying to restrict this movement. They attempt from the 1790s to organize effective treaties with the rulers of Nepal to stop their forces making incursions into British territory. This doesn't really work. And so ultimately, during a period when the British government is fighting the last of its plains Indian enemies in central India, the Governor-General finds it necessary really to teach the Nepalese a lesson. And in 1815, 1816, a number of wars occur with Nepal, which forces the Nepali rulers to accept what's called a subsidiary alliance with Britain. Now, a subsidiary alliance is a scheme developed by the British in the 18th century, whereby they have permanent diplomatic representatives at the Indian court in the form of a resident. They have virtual control over the Indian state's external policy, such so that the resident will be consulted if any treaty or arrangement is made with a third power. And in many cases, though not initially in the case of Nepal, the aim is to have a British force of soldiers stationed in the Indian state, paid for by the local ruler. Now that's the origin of the subsidiary alliance system, and the aim of Wellesley and his successors was to put all the Indian states they could manage under a subsidiary alliance system, so that in periods of conflict with external enemies, the Indian state system was firmly behind the British.
An important aspect of Hodgson's work in the court of Kathmandu was to monitor the Gurkhas' state of military preparedness. There was always the fear that the Nepalese might once again turn their sights on the northern borders of the British Raj, and he found a native government that had all the trappings of a military dictatorship.
In the 20 years we've been here since the war, we've seen nothing but drills and parades, heard nothing but the roar of cannon or the clink of the hammer in the arsenal or magazine. Soldiers have been and are heads of the law and finance at Kathmandu and administrators of the interior. Soldiers have been and are everything. And they are and have been headed by a plenary viceroy of that old stamp which must support the habitual aggression at home by pandering to the soldiery, teaching them to look to aggression abroad.
As a solution to this threat, Hodgson proposed that the British should draft a large number of Nepal's surplus soldiery into the company's army. His reports to Calcutta were full of praise for the Gurkhas' merits.
These Highland soldiers, who dispatch their meal in half an hour and satisfy the ceremonial law by merely washing their hands and face and taking off their turbans before cooking, laugh at the pharisaical rigor of our sepoys, who must bathe from head to foot and make puja before they begin to dress their dinner, must eat nearly naked in the coldest weather, and cannot be in marching trim again in less than 3 hours, the best part of the day. In war, the Gurkhas carry several days' provisions on their backs, the company's old sepoys would deem such an act intolerably degrading. The former see in foreign service nothing but the prospect of gain or glory. The latter can discover in it nothing but pollution and peril from unclean men, and terrible wizards and goblins and evil spirits. In masses, the former have that indomitable confidence, each in all, which grows out of national integrity and success. The latter can have no idea of this sentiment, which, however, maintains the union and resolution of multitudes in peril better than all other human bonds whatever. In my humble opinion, they are by far the best soldiers in India, and if they are made participators of our renown in arms, you conceive that their gallant spirit and unadulterated military habits might be relied on for fidelity, and that our good and regular pay and noble pension establishment would serve to counterpoise the influence of nationality.
His suggestion was not taken up, however, until after the Indian Mutiny. Hodgson lived with a small community of Englishmen in a Gothic mansion outside the city of Kathmandu. It was an agreeable lifestyle, even though he had to turn down, for health reasons, the opportunity of furthering his career with the Foreign Office in Calcutta.
As I sit at this moment in my study, with my cheek fanned by the most temperate of breezes, and my eye filled with the splendid garniture of Mount Arjun, I could almost consent to live and die here, and should never cast a longing look towards the third-rate society of all our Indian stations, Calcutta excepted. I am naturally of too eager a temperament for the fiery clime or the killing labours of office below, and many a time I have blessed God that he was pleased to cast my official lot in Nepal.
Nevertheless, at times he felt a great solitude. On his small allowance, remitting sums of money towards the upkeep of his family at home, there was little prospect of a return to England for many years. A letter to his father.
What will country and kin be to me if I stay above 23 years at one stretch in this land? I have, I hope, still a warm heart and a true, but nature will assert her authority. The golden links that bind us are not proof against the solvent power of time and absolute non-community of ideas and pursuits. Try it how we will, we cannot keep up a community of that sort for years unnumbered, and gradually all images of affection become shadows of shades. If then we are to know each other in this world, I must hasten to you in 1840. Meanwhile, do, if you can, keep the idea of me distinct. I remember you and my mother as clearly as though we'd parted yesterday. Yet it is true that details of the image wax fainter and fainter. God's will be done.
By 1833, he had been promoted to the post of British resident itself and found more time to concentrate on areas of personal interest. In another letter to his sister, he described a typical day in Kathmandu.
I usually, at this season when the mornings are cold and foggy, rise at 8 o'clock, go to breakfast at 9, and get up from the breakfast table at 10. Then, alas, indite a public letter to government acquainting the Right Honourable the Governor-General of the continued disposition of the Court of Kathmandu to maintain the relations of amity and concord for some time past so happily established, or turn over some of my heaps of raw material for the future investigation of the manners and institutions of the Nepalese, and sigh to see how far from sufficient for the object in view these materials still are after 10 years of research. Or mount my horse and follow the strenuous idleness of woodcock shooting. Or take up my Cuvier and seek in him how to dispose of some of my now numerous and valuable ornithological specimens. Or pore over some book taking a general and scientific view of the subject of the law, more for edification in this last instance than pleasure. Thus, one way or another, I more or less rationally consume the hours till about 4 o'clock, when if I have not been shooting, I put my hat on my head, take my stick in my hand, and stroll forth, the very model of a country gentleman, to look at my garden, my grounds, or my farmyard. At 6, home to dress for dinner, which is served at 6:30 o'clock, eating and drinking and chat, or billiards or backgammon till 9, when my 2 guests retire, and I draw back my chair to the fireside, and taking up the last work that has reached me from my bookseller in Cornhill, read and meditate till midnight, or happily till 1 o'clock, then to bed, and so ends the day.
I asked Chris Bailey the extent to which these researches would be encouraged by the East India Company itself for practical purposes.
Well, of course, there was the practical necessity. The British did need to know precisely who ruled the Indian countryside, and much of the early Orientalism, if you like, arose from a desire to know about Indian forms of land tenure. Now, Indian forms of land tenure were often closely associated with social forms. They were a reflection of institutions of Hinduism, for instance, in Hindu parts of India. And therefore, by involving oneself in the revenue management, one began immediately to ask questions about how Indian society, and indeed how Indian religion, was constituted. But quite apart from that, I think there was probably an intellectual change in Europe which is associated with this deeper interest and deeper knowledge of Indian affairs. In the early days, there had been a vague interest in Hinduism and its relationship with Christianity. But from the middle of the 18th century, in all the arts and all the sciences, we see the growth of the voracious appetite for empirical knowledge. And you can see this best, I think, in the case of a subject like botany, where there's a revolution associated with the Swedish botanist Linnaeus. Now, Linnaeus wished to classify all known plants, and his classification of plants, I think, was probably part of a much deeper desire for knowledge on the part of the European learned classes of that period, and it was soon applied also to the classification of human beings. So the British really want to have a classificatory system of Indian society which tells them at a glance who are the main castes, what the main religious groups, what are the main tenurial systems in any particular part of their Indian empire. And already in the very early days of the 19th century, you have these voluminous reports on the topography, history and ethnology of, as they're usually called, of different parts of the countryside.
Separate hour-long films could be made on Brian Hodgson's remarkable contributions to scholarship. He submitted, for instance, thousands of drawings and specimens to the British Museum and Zoological Society. His notes, which accompanied the illustrations, were in advance of the science of the day, listing geographical distribution, habits of life and breeding, and detailed measurements. He studied the vocabulary and grammar of the Himalayan peoples, and sought in this mass of data clues to the origin and development of the tribes, while his anthropological papers, describing mountain societies in scrupulous detail, provided an inspiration and a stimulus to others. Then there was the searchlight that he turned on Buddhism.
Soon after my arrival in Nepal, I began to devise means of procuring some accurate information relative to Buddhism. For though the regular investigation of such a subject was foreign to my pursuits, my respect for science in general led me cheerfully to avail myself of the opportunity afforded by my residence in a Bauda country for collecting and transmitting to Calcutta the materials for such an investigation. My first object was to ascertain the existence or otherwise of Bauda scriptures in Nepal, and to this end I privately instituted inquiries in various directions, in the course of which the reputation for knowledge of an old Bauda residing in the city of Patan drew one of my people to his abode. This old man volunteered to procure me copies of sacred texts. As he seemed very intelligent and my curiosity was excited, I proposed to him a set of questions which I desired he would answer from his books. He did so. How and when was the world created? Is matter derived from God? What was the origin of mankind? Who is Buddha? Is he God or the Creator? Or a prophet or a saint? Born of heaven or of woman? What is the motive of your good acts? The love of God? The fear of God? Or the desire of prospering in the world?
In all, he collected together some 400 Sanskrit manuscripts and 350 volumes of Tibetan texts, comprising 2 vast encyclopedias of sacred learning and philosophy presented to him by the Dalai Lama of Tibet. In Nepal, Buddhism still thrived, while it had disappeared from the Indian mainland centuries before. Thus, Brian Hodgson was able to combine textual analysis of the scriptures with ethnographic fieldwork, observing rituals and questioning informants in the old monastic courts that riddled the cities of Kathmandu and Patan. The enterprise demanded years of research, but eventually he was able to provide the Western world with its first clear and intelligible account of Buddhism. Having made use of the texts himself, Hodgson presented them to the universities and scholarly societies of Europe and India, and a prime beneficiary was the Asiatic Society of Bengal.
I propose that as a testimony of the high sense entertained by the Society of Mr. Hodgson's scientific and literary labours, and also as a mark of personal regard, he be requested to sit to some first-rate artist for his bust to be placed in its public meeting rooms.
Clearly, Brian Hodgson made a deep impression on the scholars of Europe with the quality and the quantity of his work. Together with Charles Darwin, he was one of only a handful of honorary fellows of the Ethnographic Society. When invited to Oxford, a white-haired old gentleman in his 90s, he drew crowds of young undergraduates who applauded him loudly. He possessed, one contemporary wrote, the glance of genius. This film has attempted to trace the influences and motivations behind his quest for knowledge. What were these?
No doubt the fortune of being set down in a part of Asia isolated from previous European scholarship whetted Hodgson's appetite for research. And we have already seen the encouragement that the East India Company gave to his studies. There were sound, practical reasons for doing so. But Brian Hodgson's scholarly pursuits were coloured by the intellectual considerations of the day, as Chris Bailey explained. There was, furthermore, the practical training in fieldwork provided by William Trail on those long treks through northwest India, and the intellectual influence of Thomas Malthus at Haileybury. But one motivation underlay all others. Every year he spent, slowly saving his rupees in that self-imposed exile, Brian Hodgson was dedicated to a single paramount goal: the repair of his fortunes and the eventual return to the leisurely world of gentlemanly pursuits, recalled only dimly with memories of childhood, that should have been his true heritage.
In about 6 or 7 years, I hope to rejoin you with the aid of my pension and my slender savings in prospect, for still I am in debt.
After almost 40 years residing in the Himalayas, Brian Hodgson did return home, to ride out to hounds and follow the gentle delights of English provincial society. He passed away, painlessly, in his 95th year, and lies buried in a quiet Gloucestershire churchyard.